I would like to introduce to you someone who I'm very excited to hear from, because I've also been reading Martina's work for some time, and we have a very fabulous mutual friend. But Martina is an interdisciplinary artist, curator and researcher based in Ennis, County Clare, Ireland, who recently completed her PhD at Galway University's Centre for Irish Studies. Her background is in visual culture, women's studies and birth activism. Dr. Hynan's doctoral work focused on the entanglements of birth experience with place, exploring how, particularly in rural Ireland, the transition from home to hospital birth has affected the experience of both childbirth and place of birth. Dr. Hynan has been an activist concerning injustices and dilemmas in the birth sphere for many years, and has exhibited, published and presented work about birth. In 2013, she co-developed a symposium entitled Reimagining Birth at the Humanities Institute, University College Dublin, inviting presentations addressing how childbirth has been portrayed, represented and imagined in the worlds of art and medicine, and asking what these images tell us about our cultural relationship with birth. Thank you so much, Martina.
Okay. It's lovely to be here, and I should just say that Reimagining Birth was co-convened with Doreen. So that's the connection. So I'm going to be very boring, and I'm going to read my notes because my time management skills are just not trustworthy. Yes, just to thank everybody for this invitation to speak, and it's exciting and a little daunting for me to be here, but an absolute pleasure. And it's been such a joy to work with the team in the preparation and the lead up to this event, and I'm especially delighted to see Doreen again, and to be part of any work with Doreen is always a pleasure. And I'm really grateful to have the opportunity to share some of my PhD research and hopefully contribute to the wider conversation around birthplaces. So, the origin of my research, really. So I live in County Clare in the west of Ireland, and my engagement with childbirth emerged through my work as a feminist artist. And in 1996, our mutual friend, Dr. Jo Murphy-Lawless, invited me to curate an exhibition for a conference at that time called Returning Birth to Women. So that's a long time ago, but that we were still thinking about that. So that collaboration marked the beginning of my long-standing interest in birth, in care, and the politics of place. So 2 years later, I gave birth to our daughter at home, and during that pregnancy, my understanding of birth space deepened, particularly in the response to the very strong opposition I encountered from my obstetrician. Despite this resistance, I felt the home offered the most supportive and appropriate space for me at that time. And the experience was profoundly affirming and remains one of the most transformative moments of my life. So a decade later, in 2008, I'd moved to County Clare, and I initiated a community art project called Keeping Mum. And I worked with a group of women who were campaigning to set up a midwife-led unit in County Clare. And they'd been advocating for nearly 10 years, and they were quite exhausted. And together we developed creative ways to share their birth stories. And so they were really acts of reflection and activism that made visible the ongoing lack of maternity services in the region. And just to say, there have been no maternity services in County Clare since 1987. So the unit never happened, obviously. So to this day, pregnant people in Clare must travel anywhere from 20 minutes to 2 hours to access maternity services. So this persistent reality underscores many of the questions at the heart of my research about access, embodiment, and the significance of place in shaping birth experiences. My doctoral project, On the Wisp, Rethinking Birthplace in Ireland for a More Than Human World, it reconsiders the cultural, ecological and material dimensions of birth. So the once common phrase, on the wisp or on the straw, described how women gave birth onto straw. And this phrase functions as both a metaphor and a method, foregrounding the materiality of birth and its entanglement with the environment. So drawing on environmental humanities, particularly feminist environmental humanities, my research traces the historical transformation of Irish birthing practices from home and community settings to highly medicalised institutions. So in 1900, like in many places, birth was synonymous with home, but by the end of the century, 99% of births took place in hospital. And there were 108 maternity units in 1973 in Ireland, and today there are 19. So this reflects the broader consideration of care and the gradual disconnection of birth from community and ecology. So these figures prompted my central question: does the place of birth matter? And I argue that the move from home to hospital has diminished collective engagement with birthplace as a meaningful ecological and cultural site. And birthplace is not just a location, but a relational process, a reciprocal exchange between body and environment. And rethinking birth through a more than human lens reveals the interdependencies between humans, non-humans, and the wider material world. And I think, yes, so the subtitle of my paper today, I call it like From Poetics of Space to Sympoetics of Place. So this captures my personal intellectual sort of journey that underpins my work. So when I started my PhD, I remember reading Gaston Bachelard again, and that I had read at Art College, and Poetics of Space. And his phenomenological reflections on domestic space really influenced me. And his writings on intimacy, memory, and imagination, they helped me to see birthplace as a deeply human site, infused with emotion, safety, and belonging. But over time, I became aware of the limitations of that human-centered framework. So engaging then with Donna Haraway's concept of sympoesis literally means making with, sort of helped me to expand my understanding of place beyond the human. And Haraway encourages us to think of life as co-created through the dynamic relationships of many beings and materials continually becoming together. So the movement from poetics to sympoetics signaled both a conceptual and an ethical shift, from seeing birth space as a symbolic private enclosure to recognizing it as an ecological process of interconnection. And in this view, birth is not an isolated human event, but a co-emergent act shaped by air, soil, microbes, materials, and care practices. So this reorientation invites us to imagine birth spaces that are responsive, relational, and open, places that acknowledge our shared entanglement with the living world. And so the sympoesis formed the sort of foundation of a multimodal methodology that integrates theory, art practice, and lived experience. So I've made film and sculpture and collaborative making, and through this collaborative making, I have explored how birth might be reconnected with place, ecologically, materially, and culturally. And I've got three sort of key points that I'm hopefully will hit on today or kind of talk through a bit. So to develop sort of the first insight, birthplace and material entanglement, to develop my approach, I drew on artist and philosopher Aaron Manning's notion of touch. This was early. I'm sort of giving the steps I took, if you like, in the evolution of my thesis and my practice. And so Manning's notion of touch is kind of like an ongoing process through which the body extends beyond its boundaries, reshaped by encounters with the world. And Manning's somatic focus aligns with environmental humanities scholar Stacey Alaimo's transcorporeality, which recognizes the inseparability of human and environmental matter. And together, they position the body as a living threshold, a site of continual ecological exchange. So this informed my methods of making and my material practice. And birthplace becomes a kind of choreography of human and more than human forces. And again, I drew on artist Laura Mark's concept of haptic visuality when I was making my videos and other things, and deepening that sense of embodied orientation. So in my video works, which were filmed in County Clare, I used close-up imagery of grass and air and skin and light, and invited a multisensory engagement, encouraging viewers to feel place rather than simply view it. So layering these visuals with interviewed voices, this is what's on, actually, very, very thankful to be included in the exhibition. There's I think it's about 11 minutes long, short video that I did, which is 3 sort of little vignettes, little stories in there, and I'm going to describe those bits so that if you do get a chance to watch it, it might make more sense then. So again, influenced by Haraway and also Val Plumwood, the feminist philosopher, who's called for, and I quote, a storied sense of land and place. These methods sort of foreground the reciprocity and reclaims birth as a living process of co-becoming. And I was trying to resist the anthropocentric narratives and restore an ecological and cultural depth to the act of giving birth. So the recurring phrase, on the wisp, that embodies this entangled sensibility. And historically, straw was laying on the floor for women to birth on in Ireland and other places. But it's still I just love the phrase "on the wisp." It really captured my imagination. So in my practice, early on, I started to create birthplace plaques. That you can see that circular image there. That's a birthplace plaque made from straw, pulp, and embedded with wildflower seeds. And I placed these at derelict cottages around County Clare, and I photographed them as well. And these works, they're intended to honour those who once were born there and symbolically reunite the body and land. And such gestures sort of enact this reciprocity that I've really become very interested in, and art as an act of returning touch, acknowledging birthplace as a shared ecological event. And then, so the second finding, a key finding for me, was that I've come to think of births happening in non-places. So, and I'll explain what I mean. So basically, understanding why such reimagining of birthplace is necessary requires examining how our modern obstetric systems have transformed birth. So the hospital emerges as what anthropologist Marc Auger calls a non-place. So this is a space of transit, control, where identity, intimacy, and relation are suspended. So hospital birth rooms designed for efficiency isolate the birthing body from its ecological and social environment, and birth becomes an event managed through obstetric time, which has been mentioned several times today, space, and the gaze, the obstetric gaze, detaching the body from place. So the obstetric gaze, which emerged from the 18th century on and displaced the communal and embodied knowledge that visual control and with visual control and institutional authority. So that by the 1950s in Ireland, birth had moved largely from home to the hospital setting. And this reinforces this disconnection. Similarly, obstetric time, regulated protocols such as the mechanism of protocols such as the active management of labour, again invented in Ireland in the 1960s. And then looking at Michelle Bastian, who's an environmental humanities researcher, and her particular interest in critical time studies reminds us time is political. Obstetric time privileges measurement over experience, aligning birth with industrial efficiency rather than ecological rhythm. So the medicalisation represents not only social change but ecological displacement. Many Irish women now prioritise safety over place, and their concept of safety is bound up with the hospital, revealing how birthplace has lost symbolic meaning, and the hospital erases the sensory connection, detaching birth from the wider web of life that once sustained it. So from an environmental humanities perspective, this is what I would think of as an obstetric non-place, and it's exemplified by human exceptionalism, and that is that the assumption that human processes exist apart from nature. In contrast, a sympoetic understanding situates birth within what Karen Barad, the feminist theorist and physicist, calls intra-action, the mutual shaping of bodies, matter, and environments. So reframing birth through Barad's concept of space-time mattering, this was a revelation to me. This just totally transformed my thinking. And it invites us to see birthplace as dynamic and entangled, where human and non-human elements like air and soil and architecture and light all participate in the birthing process. And the goal is not only to critique hospital systems, but to inspire ecologically attuned birth environments that foster connection, sensory awareness, and care. And then my final point there, the rethinking birthplace as sympoetic place. So a sympoetic perspective moves from the human-centered to more than human worldviews. So reframing childbirth then as that ecological collaboration involving the microbes, the materials, and memory. And all of this, within this framework, birth becomes world-making, a process that connects rather than isolates. So this orientation is embodied in my ongoing project. I'm working on a sympoetic garden at the moment, which is very exciting. For me anyway. And so it's a living environment that rethinks birth as ecological, collaborative, and restorative. And again, I'm returning to the metaphor of on the wisp. Straw as a symbol of renewal anchors this work. Straw, again, was where women birth, but also in Ireland at the moment we have an initiative called the Straw Incorporation Measure. So we're currently paying farmers to plough straw back into the ground to improve soil fertility, and this echoes this regenerative logic and this, mutual, this reciprocity, and it's a policy of renewal resonant with cycles of birth and care. So the sympoetic garden envisage birth with the world rather than in the world. So it invites design and practice that are participatory, sensory, and alive, recognizing architecture, materials, and living systems as active collaborators in care. And in 2022, I ran a workshop with, it was mainly midwives actually, and where we made wildflower seed cakes. And so the ensuing conversations about where or whether to plant them revealed the ethical complexity of sympathetic thinking, balancing care and restraint within living systems. So planting or choosing not to plant them became a metaphor for ecological responsibility, small acts of sowing worlds, as Haraway suggests. Ultimately, my research proposes that the sympathetic birth spaces, environments that integrate art, ecology, and care can restore balance between human and non-human needs. So the three insights then together, through these interwoven strands, birthplace is reclaimed not as a clinical location, but as a living ecology of relations, a site of ongoing world making where bodies, materials, and stories come into being together. And my project really sits at the intersection of Irish studies, environmental and medical humanities, and visual culture. And I use a research-led art practice method and mode of inquiry, and I use storytelling, which I'll talk a little more about, photography, video, and materials such as the paper making, and I explored how that creative practice could reimagine birth as this ecological and situated act. So, I think I might have gone on too far, have I? Oh no, here we go. I'm still on this one. So then returning to Barad, space-time mattering, this is, as I say, it's been particularly influential in my thinking. And just moving along. So they talk about how, as I say, this interaction. Oh yes, in Barad's words, the past is never finished. We never leave it, and it never leaves us behind. So this perspective reframes birthplace not as that fixed location, but as the unfolding entanglement of histories, bodies, and materials, and invites us to see how the material and cultural erasure of birthplace in Ireland still leaves traces in memory, in language, and in landscape. So at the outset of my research, I conducted a series of multi-generational interviews with people living in County Clare, and I asked them, what does birthplace mean to you? And a recurring pattern emerged. When participants spoke about birth, their stories drifted towards discussions of place, yet the two remained conceptually separate. So what do I mean? So this, basically what was happening was they could talk about their birth experiences, and they could talk about place, but the two were separate. And this disconnection pointed to what I describe as a kind of a cultural rupture, a loss of continuity between birth and its ecological context. Thinking with Barad again about the attempts to erase and always leaving traces, material traces, I began to notice how the remnants of birthplace persisted in the abandoned cottages and in the family stories and in the geography of care itself. And they became sort of central to my visual and narrative practice. And one of the outcomes was the video. This is a still from the video that's in the exhibition. And one of the groups I interviewed three men. They're members of a local community mapping group. And they are continuing it's a mapping tradition known as Din Seanchas in Irish, and it's to do with place lore. And it links family, memory, geography, and myth. It's an ancient sort of type of mapping. They're trying to incorporate that with more inherited mapping methods from colonial impositions. But anyway, so they're in their conversations. The participants recalled being born at home or in the small local nursing homes in the 50s. And one man, however, he didn't know where he'd been born. And this absence was revealing. So it illustrated how the institutionalization of childbirth has not only relocated birth physically, but has disrupted the oral and spatial knowledge that once grounded it within community life. So in the second section of the little video that you can see in the exhibition features the words of Lily. And Lily described her journey traveling from West Clare. So West Clare she's about almost 2 hours from the nearest maternity hospital. And so the film pairs her voice with passing road and traveling through the landscape, evoking what feminist philosopher Val Plumwood calls shadow places, the unseen spaces that sustain dominant systems. So the hedgerows, roads, and fields that frame Lily's journey become shadow places in motion, connecting the birthing body to infrastructures of care and control. And her story resonates globally. So I know here in Canada, for example, I know a little, not very much, about how Indigenous women have been forced to relocate to urban hospitals to give birth, disrupting traditional midwifery and ecological ties to land. And again, in Ireland, the closure of the small maternity units has created what I call a form of forced relocation by stealth. By narrowing options such as home birth, the health system compels movement, shaping how and where people give birth. And the obstetric coordination of time and space becomes a form of spatial control, echoing colonial and patriarchal patterns of displacement. So the third little video section is Armella's story. So Armella is the birth activist. She was part of the Keeping Mum project that I did in around 2008. And so she's had 3 births, 1 in hospital and 2 home. And we first met during that time when she was campaigning for a midwife-led unit to be set up. And in the interview that I conducted for my PhD, she spoke about her relationship to land. And I quote, and she says, "I believe the earth is alive. She's constantly evolving and needs people who listen, who are willing to ask, what do you need now?" End quote. So her words then, they do evoke an ecological reciprocity that echoes Robin Wall Kimmerer's idea of becoming naturalized to place, a conscious process of forming mutual relationships with the land and its histories. And to become naturalized involves an ongoing care, as both Kimmerer and Maria Puy de la Bella Casa describes, tending soil, honoring memory, and recognizing continuity between generations. Armella's activism and her decision to birth at home can be seen as acts of ecological attunement, living and birthing otherwise within a system that seeks to standardize care. So this is a still, and I made, early on in the research, I made a sort of a white gown. You can see there, it's somewhere between a christening gown and in the Irish context, and it's made with muslin, and I embedded it with straw paper that I'd made to try and, this was early on, I was trying to get to that sense of how do we carry memory. And so it's material, it's again trying to get to that sense of what is the entanglement of the human experience and how the ecological matter and creative process can signal a turning point. And it did for me in my thinking and making. And then there is another concept called through otherness in Ireland that I'd just like to share a little about. So the Irish study scholar David Lloyd, he talks about the concept of through otherness and that it offers a relational mode of being, an alternative ecology resisting imposed systems of order. So under colonial rule, English authorities viewed the Irish spatial imagination marked by communal land use and overlapping practices as chaotic. So Lloyd describes how imposition of what he terms orderly geometry as an assault on the collective customs and spatiality of the clachan or the rundale system, which was this the way that Irish people had lived. And so aiming, and it aims to erase a culture rooted in coexistence, which is what the clachan was. So through otherness describes as social ecology blending labor, leisure, human and non-human life in reciprocal daily practices. And these material conditions, Lloyd argues, were not simply natural, but sustained an alternative relationship with land and resistance to domination. And this ecology contrasts with the colonial and biomedical impulses to control nature, embodying kinship that blurred boundaries between body, environment, and life. Birthplace, too, was part of this emplaced, shared ecological rhythm. So when I was thinking about through otherness in relation to Stacey Alimo's concept of transcorporeality, her idea that all bodies are materially entangled with the environment and that matter is agential, through otherness gains a broader environmental humanities framework. Both reject human exceptionalism, emphasizing humans and non-humans as co-constitutive through exchanges of air, water, microbes, and memories, I've said. So together they propose that intra-relational existence within a more than human world, showing bodies inseparable from place and culture shaped by ecological entanglements. And viewing Irish through otherness then, this reframes traditional lifeways not as archaic, but as expressions of ecological ethics valuing interdependence over domination. These are the 2 hospitals that One is in Limerick and one is in Galway. They're the ones that people have to access in the region that I live to gain access. This is where the maternity units are, basically. So this relational worldview sharply contrasts with Auger's concept of the non-place, this anonymous functional modern space, and in childbirth the hospital exemplifies this shift. So from the 18th century, childbirth medicalisation in Ireland aligned with colonial and patriarchal shifts. The obstetric gaze, a scientific visual regime, redefined birth as a clinical procedure in standardised environments, and the birthing body became an object to observe. Lived embodied experiences gave way to anatomical models, severing connection to environment. Traditional midwives, known as handywomen or bangloon, bangloon in Irish is the Irish term, and bangloon means woman of the knee, so basically it describes their position. They would be kneeling when they were helping women. They used their ecological knowledge and herbal medicine. They were discredited and displaced. They were replaced. This replaced relational place-based knowledge, that's a mouthful, with abstract representation, detaching body from place and transforming birthplace into this clinical non-space. And I just wanted to give a very short introduction to a story of a midwife that you may know, Liz. So this is a very brief case study, and it reflects on the legacy of the late Philomena Canning, an Irish independent midwife whose work and advocacy challenged the dominant obstetric-led model of maternity care in Ireland. Philomena's life and vision continue to inspire my research and to inspire me into thinking about the reconnection of birth with place and environment through care and creativity. In the 1980s, Philomena worked as a midwife with Indigenous communities near Alice Springs in Australia, an experience she credited with revitalising her love and commitment to midwifery. And during this time, she learned from the women there whose cultural understanding of birth was deeply rooted in the land. And in 2016, during an interview, Philomena describes how the women believed that the disruption to their system of childbirth was the cause of the breakdown in their culture. And this insight profoundly shaped her belief around birth and environment and identity as inseparable. She returned to Ireland in the 80s, and she practiced as an independent home birth midwife, deeply influenced by this holistic place-based birthing practice she had witnessed in Australia. She sought to create a similar model, or her own version, I suppose, in Ireland. In 2011, she publicly announced her plans to open an independent midwife-led centre in Dublin, and she wanted to call it Alukuro House. And she said that means place of birth, that she learned that word while she was in Australia. And a local journalist described how it was to be a halfway house between home and hospital, common in Europe but largely absent in Ireland, where maternity care remains hospital-based. Philomena's efforts to establish Alukuro House were met with significant institutional resistance. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Ooh. Disaster. So Philomena, they basically, find my page. Oh no, Al, you're grand, don't worry. Al, it's all good, it's all good. I should wrap it up. Here we go. So Philomena then attempted to open this, was met with a lot of resistance. And, very briefly, so the resistance was really reflecting the broader challenges faced by those advocating for alternative birthing options in Ireland. And although the complexities of her legal and professional battles are beyond the scope of today, they do highlight the systemic reluctance to embrace models that centre women's autonomy and community-based care. She passed away in 2019 from ovarian cancer. Her belief that birth is not merely a medical event, but I think she was also aware that it is a deeply ecological and cultural process. So in Ireland today, while there is strong cultural attachment to land and nature, traditional and place-based birthing practices are rarely recognised in any way. So my research and artistic practice seeks to address this rupture, reimagining birthplace not only as a physical site, but as part of this living ecological network that connects body and land. I'll hop along to my last slide. You might think, what is she going on about here? Well, okay, in Ireland today, so interest in place and environmental renewal, it runs deep. It's really, really active, and particularly in County Clare where I live. This is some images of the Burren. And literally this weekend, we have the Winterage Festival happening in the Burren. So tomorrow, people will gather and they will herd the cattle from the lowlands to the uplands. It's an ancient tradition. It's a form of reverse transhumance. And in the way back, they would have gone up with the animals and stayed up there. But they don't do that now. They just herd them up there. And it's become a big festival. And that's actually happening this weekend. And it's now recognized as part of Ireland's intangible cultural heritage. And it honors a way of life that once shared between people, animals, and landscape. Yet, the people, as I say, they don't stay there, they just herd them, which I think is really interesting. So for me, such practices offer inspiration for reimagining birth space, recognizing that interdependence between the humans and the more than human world, and understanding that we too are participants in cycles of care and renewal. And this duality, connection remembered, disconnection lived, mirrors the current state of birth in Ireland. Birthplace remains culturally tied to land and lineage, yet the act of birth itself has become detached from environment and community. And I'll scoot along just so I finish up for you. Thank you very much. Okay, I'm going to skip a whole load of stuff and go to the last slide. Okay. Scott Gilbert, I'm just putting in, we're all holobiont by birth. We can talk more about that in the discussion if we like. So while my research exposes how birthplace has been marginalized in dominant medical knowledge, it explores how birth narratives might be reimagined to include the more than human perspectives. So I'm going to skip along, and I'll probably just wrap it up, I think. And I can talk more about the Sympathetic Garden that I'm working on with people at home as well. And just to leave you with this reflection, so through cultivating a sympathetic garden, both as a concept and material practice, I'm hoping that to develop a future where it's this reciprocal growing becomes an understandable way of connecting birth with place. So I'm hoping it will be a transformative maternity care setting. I would love if we could include a sympathetic garden within birth spaces. And to be born on the wisp is to be born in relation, to recognize that life, like straw returned to the earth, continually regenerates through connection. The future of birth space, I believe, is sympathetic, collaborative, entangled and alive, a practice of care, creativity, and co-becoming that reconnects birth to the living world. So I'm going to stop there. I have a couple of slides with resources if anybody's interested in those. And thank you so much.